Recording.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to your history class. Today, we're going to have a lecture about the Middle Ages and feudalism and living on a manor. Okay. The medieval church, the Holy Roman Empire. The Middle Ages takes place after the fall of Rome and before, before the Renaissance. So it's after Rome and it's before the Renaissance. Therefore, it's in the middle. Okay. And the Middle Ages was sometimes thought of as a very dark time. They had the Black Plague, which was a plague that took place because things weren't that clean. There were a lot of rats, and rats would carry the disease, and they would bite people, or people would get the disease and transmit it. And a lot of people died during that time. It was a time where people were, they too were persecuted in the early Middle Ages, where Christians were brought into the Colosseums and amphitheaters to fight off lions. Of course, they would lose. But there were good parts of the Middle Ages as well. So I'm going to just start this lecture with a video, and it's called The Middle Ages in 10 Minutes. It's just going to show you what the Middle Ages were like, and then we'll talk about them. Okay, let's see if this will work. Okay.
This video is brought to you by Captivating History. The Middle Ages, the period of European history between the 5th century and the 15th century, is an era with an unfounded reputation. Also called the Dark Ages or medieval times, most people associate this time with brutal cruelty, devastating wars, and great plagues. Worse, it's often considered as a time when society, academics, and the arts did a backward slide. Although there were wars, plagues, and a fair share of cruelty during the Middle Ages, it was not a period of history when intellectual pursuits came to a halt. Great strides were taken. The spread of Christianity, the Crusades, the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Hastings, the Magna Carta's penning, and Geoffrey Chaucer's works are just a few of its highlights. Let's look at some of the Middle Ages' key moments, beginning with the Roman Empire's fall and continuing until the Renaissance. For centuries, Rome held tight control over much of Europe, parts of North Africa, and portions of the Middle East. But the empire experienced growing pains. Its landholdings were so vast that it was impossible to defend its borders. Infighting and civil wars weakened Rome from the inside out. Christians, a group that started in the minority, were often rounded up by the Romans and forced to battle the fierce gladiators in the Colosseum, a favorite entertainment form for Roman citizens. But as Christianity spread, the prevailing beliefs of people underwent a profound change. A weakened Roman Empire was exactly what some other groups in Europe were hoping for. The Germanic tribes and Visigoths saw it as an opportunity. Alaric, a Goth leader, developed the final blow to the Roman Empire. Furious that the Roman emperor refused to keep his promise, granting his people Roman citizenship in territories in the Balkans, Alaric was determined to get what was promised to him. He formed a massive army comprised of Goths, Huns, and former Roman slaves who marched across the Alps and into Italy to confront the Roman Emperor Honorius. A foolish and self-centered leader, Honorius remained in his villa as the Goth
So
army
he doesn't
approached the city.
pay attention to the fact that they're
Ignored the
coming.
threat and refused to listen to his advisors, who came to warn him of the impending battle. Alaric cut off the supply chain going into the city and waited for it to become sufficiently weak before he attacked. Rome was left wounded, but not dead. Yet it could not recover its former glory. The end of the Roman Empire came in 476, when the heir to the empire, a 14-year-old boy, was displaced. The fall of the once great Roman Empire drastically changed the face of Europe, allowing other groups, like the Goths, to become more powerful. The demise of the Roman Empire marked the start of the Middle Ages. One group able to gain more power and control after Rome's fall was the Byzantines, who thought of themselves as Roman. Their empire, centered in Constantinople, was almost like the relocation of Rome. In fact, Constantine originally called the city New Rome. After Constantine died, the Byzantine Empire splintered. In the southeastern part of Europe, a charismatic leader and extraordinary military strategist named Charlemagne used his power of persuasion and his great armies to unite much of Western Europe. The son of a king, and destined to become a king himself, Charlemagne conquered the Saxons, a powerful Germanic tribe, forcing them to convert to Christianity. Like Constantine, however, the empire Charlemagne built could not survive his death. As armies marched to and fro across Europe, so did Christianity. However, the church's teachings were divided into two philosophies: the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. Regardless of the differences, Christianity worked its way into all aspects of life for people living in the Middle Ages, becoming the most powerful entity of its time. The Middle Ages is almost synonymous with knights riding off to the Holy Land to fight in the Crusades. Christians, Jews, and Muslims all felt a connection to the Holy Land in the Middle East. In the 11th century, Muslims expanded their landholdings to include many sacred religious locations. European Christians feared that the Holy Lands, so important to their religion, would be destroyed or blocked by the Muslims. Their solution was to reclaim them in the church's name. Beginning in 1095 and lasting until 1291, pious European knights banded together to journey on crusades to Jerusalem and other key locations in the Holy Land. Powerful kings financed the knights, but as the crusades proved less and less effective, these wealthy patrons questioned their return on investment. After 200 years of fighting and plundering in the Holy Lands, the crusades ended. Meanwhile, on the British Isles, the English were building their nation away from the continent's conflicts. Descended from the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, with a healthy dose of Roman influence, the English experienced a crisis when their heir to the throne was disputed. One of the most significant moments in the Middle Ages history was the Battle of Hastings in 1066, which was fought to establish the crown's rightful heir. The battle also ushered in the Norman conquest of England. The royal succession line had been established, but some kings were less interested in ruling the land than others. For example, King Richard felt it was more important to go on crusades than to deal with the matters back in England. Various members of nobility rose to fill the void left by King Richard and other monarchs like him, but their hold on power was tenuous. Once a new king took over, these nobles were relocated back to their previous positions, and many resented the king for this. King John and a group of noblemen met to discuss possible solutions. In 1215, they drafted the Articles of the Barons, the rough draft that later became the Magna Carta, one of the more important documents in Europe. The Magna Carta ensured that the king would protect the holdings of land barons in England from outside invaders, such as France. In return, the noblemen would remain loyal to the king. The noblemen's rights and roles were outlined, and they were guaranteed to retain their land holdings and political influence from monarch to monarch. Because of the Magna Carta, England became a united country, able to concentrate its efforts on building its global empire. Just as England had to deal with the issues of succession, France was thrown into turmoil when King Charles IV failed to produce an heir to the throne. A power grab ensued, and it took a long time and much bloodshed to resolve. The War of French Succession lasted 116 years, from 1337 to 1453, but historians rounded down, labeling this the 100 Years' War. Fighting was not contained to just France, but included several countries, including England. An unlikely hero emerged from the 100 Years' War.
This is Joan of Arc.
A teenage girl we know as Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, born around 1412 to a peasant family. At the age of 13, she began having visions that compelled her to fight to recognize Charles VII as the rightful king. Dressed in battle armor, Joan of Arc led soldiers against the English. She succeeded for a time, but was captured by the English, who charged her with crimes of heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing. She was burned at the stake in 1431. While Middle Ages wars were brutal and devastating, an even deadlier force was about to be unleashed on Europe. The booming population put a strain on food production, resulting in famine, starvation, and malnutrition. In 1347, the Great Plague, a deadly illness, was brought to the land from traders from Asia and the Near East. It spread quickly from merchant ships and through the unsanitary cities of Europe, most likely carried by rats. The fleas that bit the rats then transmitted the disease, bubonic plague, to the humans they bit. The plague killed healthy people within a week, caused horrendous skin boils, fevers, and bloody coughing fits. Historians believe that the deadly disease killed as much as a third of the population of Europe. To make matters worse, the plague was not a one-time occurrence. It periodically swept through Europe again throughout the centuries, though subsequent outbreaks were not as deadly as the first. The Black Death, as it became known, has a tremendous impact on the Middle Ages. It caused people to question the Christian Church's doctrine, become more suspicious, and worry about their reliance on others for food. Losing so many people gave room for a middle class to evolve, as many opened shops and crafted goods to sell. It altered the politics of Europe, as different people were elevated to positions of power to replace those who died. The plague forced people to think differently about politics and religion and become more independent. This change in attitudes and thinking helped bring about the Dark Ages' end, ushering in a new age, the Renaissance. To discover more about the history of
Okay. So we saw a lot of things about the Middle Ages. Let's go over a few of them. We talk about the Middle Ages as being a dark time because of the way the Christians were treated, because of the Crusades, where there were violent fighting for 100 years, because of the plagues that came during that time. But we did hear in this video about writings that were done that are still known and are famous today. But during that time, many universities were established in Europe and laws were established that hadn't been in place before. And there was religious reform. And there was also the start of tourism, going from one place to another. Christianity rises during this time. And the persecution of Christians is stopped. There are literary works. There are writings and books that are very famous. The Canterbury Tales are one. The Divine Comedy is another. And the Song of Roland is another. The most wealthy and influential people had cathedrals and churches built because at that time, everyone believed that God and the church ruled everything. During that time, there was a lot of gold and precious gems used in jewelry. Painting was going on, textiles, but most of them were religious in nature, based on religion. You saw about the Byzantine Empire. It didn't crumble like the rest of the West did. It remained strong and a strong political area for quite some time. Byzantine Empire was ruled by from Constantinople, and they thought of themselves as the new Rome, just as you saw. What did they have to pattern it off of? Rome. Rome was successful for a long time, so why can't they be the new Rome? The Hagia Sophia was one of the world's largest churches, and it was a major center of artistic production during the Middle Ages. Hagia Sophia. Charlemagne was ruling during this time, and he did it for about 50 years. He worked hard to keep Western Europe united, so it wouldn't fragment. Because remember, if it breaks off into a lot of little places, it makes that area weak. He established schools to promote learning and culture, and he was instrumental. He was the leader of spreading Christianity throughout the land. And during this time, this area became very prosperous, as much as it had been during the Roman Empire. After he died, though, his three sons inherited the leadership, and they fought with each other. And the empire becomes weakened and it disintegrates. It goes away. It crashes. It dissolves. During this time, you hear the term feudalism. Charlemagne's empire was destroyed when his sons took hold of it and Vikings began to invade. The Vikings came from Northern Europe. The invasions were very fierce, and the feudalism began to develop. Under feudalism, land was divided, land outside of cities, in an orderly manner to prevent invading Vikings and others from coming in and taking over the land. The land was owned by kings and or lords, and the power became to the king or the lord, and they controlled the land. These landowners were nobles. They were higher class people, or like barons and princesses. They had people who took care of their land. They were called vassals. So it was like sort of a mini kingdom everywhere. All right. And the people who were vassals promised to follow the rules and regulations of the barons or the kings, and also to fight for the rights of those kings or barons. So they owed their alliances to the king because the king provided them with a place to live, land to farm. Vassals many times were knights. You saw the knights. They had their armor. They fought each other. Knights were professional horse soldiers during the Middle Ages. The manor was typically taken care of by a vassal, and most manors were located far outside of town so that farming could be taken care of. They were self-sufficient on the manor, meaning that they could take care of themselves. They grew their own food. They built their own homes. They farmed their own land, produced their own food, and had livestock as well. Everything they needed was on the manor. Peasants or serfs were there who lived on the manor to work. They were treated very poorly. Did we hear about that in your sociology lecture? They were persecuted. They were very poor. They did not get paid. And most only were given a very small parcel of land, very small part of land to farm, to provide food for their family. They mainly were workers that made the manor happen. During the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church begins to rise up and play a major role all through Europe. The local church was the center of town where people came to talk and get guidance. The only recognized religion at the time was Christianity in this area. People were reliant on the church for everything, for spiritual guidance, help through hardships, protection. Anything that they needed, they felt that the church would be able to provide for them. The church had enormous power and influence over the people. They made laws and they influenced how people lived, and they influenced the rulers as well. So the kings relied on the church. The church wasn't always so great, though. There was a lot of corruption in the church. The church had a lot of money, power, and land. Let's look at this video, Catholic Church in Medieval Times, to get an idea of what power and what the church had to do at this time. Okay.
The Catholic Church saw itself as being in charge and taking care of all people. It claimed the right to rule and direct society. The Church performed many jobs modern nation-states do today. For example, they would try civil and criminal cases involving clerics. Decisions made by the Church on matters such as marriage, divorce, and inheritances were binding and enforced by local law enforcement officials. The Catholic Church had its own social pyramid. At the top was the Pope. The Pope was the head of the Catholic Church. He lived in the Papal States, which included the city of Rome. The archbishops were directly below the Pope and enforced his decrees and instructions. Following the archbishops were bishops, priests, and deacons. These church officials interacted more with the people and administered the sacraments. According to the Catholic Church, there were 7 major sacraments. Those sacraments were baptism, communion, penance, confirmation, marriage, holy orders, and last rites. Baptism was the earliest sacrament. Water was sprinkled on a baby's head, and the parents promised to raise their child in the Catholic Church. The water's purpose was to wash away original sin. This was Adam and Eve's sin of eating the apple in the Garden of Eden. The sacrament of communion originates from the Last Supper during the Jewish holiday of Passover. Jesus was believed to have turned the bread at this supper into his own flesh and the wine into his own blood. Catholics believe that priests did the same thing during Mass in a process called transubstantiation. Receiving the Eucharist, or communion, was the second sacrament. The sacrament of reconciliation was the act of confessing sins to the local priest or bishop. It was believed that by confessing sins and paying a penance, they would be forgiven and go to heaven. The fourth sacrament was that of confirmation. It confirmed a person's dedication and loyalty to the Church. The fifth and sixth sacraments were marriage and holy orders. You could not receive both sacraments. You either married or you took holy orders. That is, you became a priest, monk, or nun. The final sacrament was that of extreme unction, or anointing of the sick. This was the final blessing for the sick and dying members of society and is known today as the last rites. In the Middle Ages, churches provided a level of stability. Markets, festivals, and religious ceremonies took place at local churches. Church leaders became advisors to local rulers. Every village had a church. These churches regulated behavior, taught expectations, and consequences. Medieval education had to be paid for, therefore it was mainly accessible to the wealthy. Peasants could only be educated if the lord of their manor allowed it. If a family attempted to educate their sons without permission, they were heavily fined. The most educated were people who worked in the church. These people lived in monasteries, convents, and worked in local churches. Some boys were trained to become priests. Prior to the 15th century, there were no seminaries or specific schools that taught how to be a priest. Due to this, boys were sent to live with practicing priests to learn from them and work as their apprentices. They basically took care of the priests, and in doing so, learned what they did from day to day. Once the priest retired, the boy would take over his position. There eventually became a point when some realized that in order to move their society forward, the people needed an education. In response to this, wealthy merchants set up grammar schools in their towns. Latin grammar was a key focus in these schools. Latin was important because it was the language of communication between merchants. Boys had to learn the information through memorization. There was no ensured depth of understanding. In addition, the teachers taught the older boys, and then these older boys had the responsibility of teaching the younger ones. School lasted from sunrise to sunset, making for very long days. Students were punished by whippings. Students who excelled in grammar school were able to move on to universities in the Middle Ages. Oxford and Cambridge were both founded during this time by the Catholic Church. Girls were mostly educated on how to keep a household. If they were wealthy, they might be educated within their household or abroad. In addition to keeping a household, girls were occasionally taught to sing or play an instrument. Monks and nuns copied, collected, and stored texts that contained religious knowledge. There were no such things as computers, typewriters, or even printing presses during the Middle Ages. Books were copied out by hand, page by page. Most books were kept in monasteries and convents across Europe. A monastery was a place where very religious men went to devote their entire lives to the Catholic Church, and a convent was a place where very religious women devoted their lives to the Catholic Church. They lived according to a strict set of rules. Monks might spend hours a day copying documents and manuscripts. Because of this, books were very expensive, and very few people had access to books outside the Catholic Church. Artwork during the Middle Ages was also heavily influenced by the Catholic Church. Art in this time period included metalwork, illuminated manuscripts, Pisek paintings, silversmiths, goldsmiths, embroidery, mosaics, tessera, sculpture, stained glass, and heraldry. Animals and florals in the art world were very important during this time period. Also, shields and other armors of the soldiers reflected in the Roman style. Architecture was another type of art during the Middle Ages. Gothic architecture was not intended to be dark, as is often shown and used. The intention behind the Gothic style was actually to bring in light. Notable features of the Gothic style include the pointed arch, large columns, vaulted ceilings, ornate stonework in the arch windows, extensive ribwork on the vaulted ceilings, and columns that extended all the way to the ceiling and became a part of the vault. After the medieval time period, the architectural style will shift back to the neat and tidy lines that came before it, as opposed to the flowery and intricate designs of the Gothic era. By controlling education and book production, the Catholic Church ensured its view of Christianity became medieval culture. Because Latin was the universal language of the Church, it was taught to both those entering the clergy and entering government services. Many current beliefs and practices of the Catholic Church were established during the Middle Ages, including transubstantiation and fixing the number of sacraments at 7. The Virgin Mary, Mother of Jesus, was moved from a minor figure in the New Testament to a figure of great reverence. Along with praying to the Virgin Mary, praying to the saints became important, as well as a means for sinners to ask for their help in intervening with God to lessen his wrath. The Church's liturgy was revised, and its teachings were codified in the Middle Ages to ensure uniformity. Many of these practices were adopted by various Protestant churches after the Reformation. Because the powers of heaven were contested and often overcome by the powers of evil, life was considered an unending struggle with the devil and his minions. The devil's powers often thought to turn men and women into his active agents in spreading evil through the land. The last worshippers of paganism were eliminated by the Church, declaring these people as worshippers and agents of Satan and helping him spread evil in the world. Jews were also considered the enemies of good Christians by the Catholic Church. Church propaganda claimed Jewish practices included the kidnapping and murder of children. This allowed some parents to send unwanted children into the forest to die, as told in the story of Hansel and Gretel, then blamed the children's death on the Jews. The fear of Satan's power led to the Catholic Church conducting trials of people accused of heresy or witchcraft. This led to fear in Europe because the accused did not have to face their accuser, who may have lied about someone for various reasons. The Inquisition helped stamp out different beliefs and strengthen the Catholic Church's hold on Europe. Another attempt by the Catholic Church to impose its will in the world was the Crusades. Called by Pope Urban, the Crusades were an attempt to take the Holy Land from Muslims. Many Europeans felt the need to participate in the Crusades because of the power of the Catholic Church and its influence on its members. After heavy loss of life, the Crusades failed in capturing the Holy Lands. The Inquisition and Crusades harmed the reputation of the Catholic Church, and that lasts till this day. The Catholic Church continued the belief that relics from religious figures had the spirit of the person who possessed the items. Also, the Catholic Church built so many churches that the medieval Europeans were never far away from a church and its many offerings of services they provided. These churches were also the scenes of village festivals adapted by the Catholic Church from pagan rituals in order to convert Europeans to Christianity.
Right, so that gave you a glimpse of medieval times and how the church was influential, how it controlled everything. There were churches everywhere. All events of importance took place in or around the church. Christianity was getting to be very, very strong, and people relied on the church for everything to take care of their every need. The Holy Roman Empire comes up in the Middle Ages as well. And it was something in the western and southern part of Europe. And its first emperor was Charlemagne. We saw Charlemagne in the video. His name also means Charles the Great. And it was called the Holy Roman Empire after Rome, and because the holy part comes from the church, guiding everything through it. During this time, the Crusades are taking place. You've seen it in 2 of the videos. These were ways to take back the Holy Land, Jerusalem. The Christians were worried that other religions were taking over the Holy Land, especially Jerusalem, and that they would not have access to those lands. The Crusades were supported by the church and by rich people. And as I said, it was designed to get the Holy Land back, especially from the Islamic Empire. It's estimated that during the Crusades, 1.7 million people died. So this is another reason why the Middle Ages is considered to be a dark time, okay? A dark time. The plague, the Black Plague, was a dark time. It killed many people. There were these crusades where many people died, people are fighting, and they went on for many, many years, the 100 Years' War, and it was a dark time. Dark meaning angry time, scary time, not dark in the color, okay? The goal of the Crusades was to limit the spread of Islam and to take control of Jerusalem again. The first crusade was started by Pope Urban, you heard about that, and he ordered the war to restore Christianity to the land. And he also believed that these crusades, bloody as they were supported by God. I'm going to show you a video, short video about the Crusades. Let's see if I can find that.
One of the most interesting states throughout European history has always been the Holy Roman Empire, made up of who knows how many smaller principalities, kingdoms and bishoprics. The question is, how did the Holy Roman Empire work? How did such a massive collection of states with differing interests manage to stay united for nearly 1,000 years? Given that the Holy Roman Empire existed for so long, its administration obviously changed a great deal. Thus, we'll pick the late 18th century to look at because some of the old ways of doing things were still around and the politics was generally much more interesting too. So as of the late 18th century, the Holy Roman Empire was divided like this. The Archduchy of Austria was the most important of these lands and was home to the Habsburg imperial family. Roughly a third of the empire's lands was controlled by the Habsburgs, with another 20% being part of Prussia and the rest being ruled by the others. As of 1765, the head of the Habsburgs was Joseph II, who held several imperial titles. The most important of these was obviously that of Holy Roman Emperor, which was an elected position. Elections weren't open to the public or anything, that would be silly, and during elections there were only 9 eligible voters. These voters were the sovereign rulers of these lands and included people like Maria Theresa, Joseph's mother, King George III of the United Kingdom, who was also the King of Hanover, and Frederick II of Prussia, better known as Frederick the Great. So how exactly did this emperor run his empire? Well, in a word, barely. Whilst the numerous rulers whose realms made up the empire did promise to remain loyal to the emperor, in reality those promises were worth sweet nothing. Many states within the empire, known formally as estates, fought wars against each other, sided with foreign powers against the emperor, and generally just did as they pleased. There was no fixed capital, and the administration of the empire was mostly done from wherever the emperor was at the time, which at this point was mostly Vienna. The empire was formally subdivided into what are called imperial circles for the purposes of administration and for the collection of taxes. So the emperor was the embodiment of the executive arm of government, but his authority over the rest of the empire could be pretty weak at times. Obviously, this all meant that the HRE had an extremely weak central authority that largely relied on the big scary Austrian army and a fear of outside invasion to keep it all together. That said, there were arms of government which could and did act with authority across the empire. The first was the legislative arm, personified in the Imperial Diet, which was based in Regensburg. This was the primary means of representation for the individual estates and their rulers. The Diet was made up of 3 sections called colleges. College number 1 was the electoral college, made up of the electors of the empire, whose task it was, as previously said, to be bribed by the Habsburgs into electing them as emperor. College number 2 was the College of Princes, basically the rest of the nobility, whose job it was to stop the electors and emperor from stomping on them. College number 3 was the College of Cities, made up of representatives of the free cities of the empire, and this was by far the least important section of the Diet. So the way it legislated was that the emperor's representative, most often the Archbishop of Mainz, would bring a proposition to the Diet to be voted into law. The electors, who had 1 vote each, would decide whether or not they would support this law, and if a majority supported it, it would be brought to the princes. The princes also got 1 vote each, with some exceptions in which certain lands were grouped together in what are called benches. Benches had 1 collective vote, and because of dynastic politics, some princes got several. Also, some of these princes, like the electors, were heads of foreign states, and so foreign interests led to a lot of gridlock. Anyway, if a majority of the princes agreed to a proposal, then it would become law, and if not, then things would be negotiated until either it did or until everybody went home. The College of Free Cities also got a vote, but it was only advisory, and thus everybody ignored it.
So you could see that it was very controlled, the Holy Roman Empire, by very few people. So that ensured that the rulers would stay in power. I'm just going to see if I have one more video for you. Hold on. Let's see. America. I guess I don't have one about, the knights and fighting and chivalry, but that was a time where people were in castles. The knights would be fighting each other in armor. You saw, even when you saw Joan of Arc, she was fighting in armor. This went on for a long time, and the knights were helping to preserve the kingdoms and the manors and support and fight for the king at the time. So we looked at this period of time of the Middle Ages that took place between the fall of the Roman Empire and the beginning of the Renaissance. Renaissance means enlightenment. Next week, we will have a review, a full class review for the following week's final exam, okay? So week 7 is the final exam. The midterm exam, I'm sorry. And I will make sure that we're posting right now a review sheet, a partial review sheet for the exam. And then we'll talk about, like I said, we'll talk about the review, and then we will post your final midterm exam for you in my portal, and you'll take it and you'll remember the same rules that you have to complete it once you finish the exam. The midterm will be 20 questions, and they will all be multiple choice. It will cover up to the period through the Crusades, and from the beginning of the course. I've asked Jake to post a partial review sheet for you today, and we'll post another one for next week. And by using those 2 review sheets, you'll be able to cover the fall of the Roman Empire. You'll be talking about the Greeks. We'll be talking about Mesoamerica. And all of those topics that we came up, I will give you the highlights of those to help you study for your final your midterm exam. I'm trying to rush this and give you a final exam. I'm sorry. But I hope that you have a wonderful week. You've been doing very well with checking your assignments, and I'm very pleased with that. And I hope that you're enjoying some of the videos and discussion about history that we've been going through. I look forward to seeing you next week. Be well.